In the swirling chaos of the 1960s, a time defined by rebellion, free love, and radical change, a darker undercurrent existed beneath the bright veneer of liberation. For many young women coming of age in this era, promises of freedom and self-expression were often overshadowed by the same societal traps their mothers had faced: patriarchal control, emotional dependence, and the search for love in all the wrong places. This is the story of 3 teenage girls who joined Charles Manson's family, each seeking connection and belonging, but instead finding themselves drawn into a world of manipulation, danger, and heartbreak. Despite the advent of the birth control pill and a culture that celebrated sexual freedom, these girls weren't simply rejecting the system in pursuit of independence. Many came from homes steeped in traditional values where women were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that their worth lay in their ability to secure the attention and approval of men. Even in an era of supposed liberation, the weight of societal expectations still loomed large. This is why so many young women fell prey to the charm of men who claimed to offer an escape from those norms, only to replicate them in more insidious ways. For the girls who joined the Manson family, Charles Manson embodied the perfect contradiction: a countercultural figure who preached freedom and love while ruling his followers with emotional manipulation and an iron fist. These girls, like many others who joined the family, weren't radicals or hardened criminals. They were impressionable teens, some from broken homes, others simply looking for a way to matter in a world that seemed indifferent to their existence. The family offered them a sense of belonging, a home, and the promise of unconditional love. For a time, it seemed they had found what they were searching for, but the price was high. When the family's crimes became national news in 1969, the arrests of Manson and his followers shattered any illusions these girls might have had. The free love they thought they had found was revealed to be a facade for domination. Each young woman was forced to reckon with the life-altering consequences of their choices. Was loyalty to Charlie worth the cost of their freedom, their future, or their humanity? Through their stories, we'll explore not just the aftermath of the Manson family's arrests, but also the emotional journeys of these teenage girls, how they came to be part of this infamous group, the relationships that drew them in, and the societal forces that made them vulnerable to the manipulations of men who failed to protect them, or worse, actively endangered them. Their paths diverged after the arrests, but their experiences remain a poignant reminder of how the search for love and belonging can lead even the brightest, most hopeful spirits into the darkest places. On August 3, 1969, Charles Manson left Spahn Ranch in a Hostess bread truck, intending to head to Santa Barbara and further north. He was leaving days after the murder of Gary Hinman, a Topanga Canyon musician and family associate killed by Bobby Beausoleil for reasons that keep changing by the decade. During 2 days in late July, Bobby, Susan Atkins, and Mary Bruner basically held Gary hostage in an effort to shake him down for money. During that time, after a scuffle in the kitchen, Charlie was called and asked to intervene. Manson came with family member Bruce Davis, and during a brief but very heated exchange with Hinman over money, Manson drew a sword and cut the victim down his temple, nearly severing his ear. Charlie and Davis departed, and early the next morning, Hinman was stabbed to death by Beausoleil, quite possibly at the urging of Manson, and certainly to protect himself from Charlie's wrath. But the act of murder potentially jeopardized Manson, who was on federal parole that summer after years of incarceration. If he got implicated in a homicide, he'd be tossed back in prison on a parole violation. So instead, Charlie split the scene, possibly looking to score drugs, possibly to meet up later with Beausoleil in San Francisco, and possibly just to ditch the family altogether. But Manson didn't get far. He drove to Santa Barbara and picked up some drugs and hit the road again. Just before dawn on Monday, August 4th, Charlie encountered Stephanie, a pregnant 17-year-old, at a service station near Gorda, about 50 miles south of Big Sur. Stephanie, who was camping near the beach with her boyfriend, walked into the gas station restroom where Manson was. He flirted with her, discovered she wasn't happy with the guy she was with, and asked if she would rather join him. She agreed, as long as he would drive her back to San Diego in a couple days. They camped together beside the Pacific, dropping acid and frolicking in the ocean waters before making love. Later that day, Manson again purchased gas at a station in Lucia along U.S. Highway 1 using a stolen credit card. On Tuesday, August 5th, Manson and Stephanie arrived at Esalen Institute in Big Sur in the late afternoon. According to their website, Esalen is a holistic retreat and non-profit educational institute, established in 1962 and considered the epicenter of the human potential movement, or basically a retreat center for the New Age community. From multiple sources, we know that Charlie went to Esalen during some kind of musical gathering in hopes of performing and furthering his music and songwriting career. From those same sources, we know that instead, Manson experienced some kind of rejection at Esalen. Stephanie later told police, "Then we went by the Esalen Institute, where I think Charlie had hopes to get some recording people on his side to record some music." Officer: "Did you go in with him?" Stephanie: "No, I didn't." Officer: "When he came out, was there a change in his attitude at all?" Stephanie: "No." She then contradicts what she just said. Officer: "When he came out of Esalen, was he even more angry?" Stephanie: "Well, yeah, he was. He seemed to kind of stick to himself. He was obviously angry, was not real communicative with me, so I was just along. I was just kind of along at that point." In fact, hours after they departed Esalen, Charlie slapped Stephanie. She explained, "We had seen some people hiking in Big Sur, and he was hoping they would provide us with dinner. They were afraid. He came into the van and gave me a slap and told me I ruined his chances for dinner that night." Wednesday, August 6th, Bobby Beausoleil was arrested along Highway 101 on suspicion of Gary Hinman's murder and booked to jail. Charlie, in the meantime, had become so enamored of Stephanie that he changed his plans for traveling north. In the late afternoon that Wednesday, Charlie and Stephanie departed Big Sur, heading south, purchasing gas at service stations in San Luis Obispo and Chatsworth. They arrived at Spawn Ranch in time for a late dinner, but left again the next morning. Charlie and the family were currently unaware of Bobby's arrest that day. On Thursday, August 7th, Manson, as agreed, drove Stephanie to San Diego. They left early in the day, arriving in San Diego in either late afternoon or early evening. By late that night, Charlie and Stephanie were preparing to leave San Diego to return to the ranch. After getting Stephanie's possessions and having dinner with her relatives, we headed back to Spawn. Though we could have made it back that night, I was in no hurry. I was clinging to the pleasures of the moment and losing the tensions that had been pounding in my head for the last few months. We spent the night sleeping beside the truck. We counted stars, told stories, and made love. The early morning sun woke us up. It was August 8th, 1969. They were actually pulled over in Oceanside on their return north, and Charlie was ticketed for speeding. On the morning of Friday, August 8th, Charlie and Stephanie returned to Spawn Ranch. Charlie was immediately told about Bobby's arrest after a call had come in the night before, letting the family know that Beausoleil had been picked up. Manson became very passive-aggressive, threatening to leave again because everything was falling apart. He also made a point of informing everyone that he promised Stephanie to be true to her. That's right, ladies. Charlie, the spiritual and sexual leader of the family, had become a one-woman man. The day at Spawn Ranch was spent dropping acid and giving Stephanie the chance to meet the rest of the group. Late that afternoon, Manson sent Sandra Good and Mary Bruner out to buy supplies, and the rest settled down for dinner. Around 10 p.m. that evening, Sandra called the ranch to let them know she and Mary had been arrested for using a stolen credit card, and the Hostess bread truck, which they used that night in San Fernando Valley, had been confiscated. They would need several $100s in bail money to get them out. It was then, allegedly, that Charlie summoned Tex Watson and gave him orders to drive to Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon near Hollywood to kill the occupants. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian were also told to go with Watson and to do whatever he told them to do. Manson watched the killers drive away and then went back to join Stephanie in the travel trailer they were sleeping in. During the bloodbath at Cielo, Linda Kasabian witnessed her friends murder 5 people, although she herself did not kill anyone. The next night, the same group went out again, but this time Charlie joined them, along with Steve Grogan and Leslie Van Houten. Watson, Van Houten, and Krenwinkel were sent into the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca to kill them, and Charlie and the others drove to Venice Beach, potentially to find more victims. The only people killed that night, however, were the LaBiancas. The others returned to Spawn Ranch by early morning. A day later, Linda Kasabian had the opportunity to leave when Charlie asked her to go visit Good, Bruner, and Beausoleil, each at their respective jails. Linda attempted to flee, but was unable to do so, in part because her young daughter was there. So she waited until the next day and again tried to take her toddler and leave, but could not get access to the child. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi wrote, "That night she packed a shoulder bag with some clothing and Tanya's diapers and pins and hid it in the parachute room. On going to get the bag, however, she found Manson and Stephanie Schramm sleeping in the room. Deciding to forget the bag, she went to get Tanya, but discovered that the children had been moved to the waterfall area. Linda left without her daughter, believing the child would be safe, but she was afraid for her own life." Several days later, Spawn Ranch was raided in the overnight hours on a months-long investigation that began that spring with a report of a stolen VW Beetle. Stephanie was among those at the ranch during the raid. She and Charlie were sleeping in the Rock City Cafe when police showed up. The family were taken into custody, the children were all placed in protective services, and a variety of alleged stolen goods were confiscated. But days later, the entire group was released on what we have been told was an administrative error. 4 days after Charlie and the others were released, police returned to Spawn Ranch. They found Stephanie and Charlie together, both nude. Charlie had what appeared to be a joint in his hand, and he was arrested. Even though the police determined that the joint was merely a hand-rolled tobacco cigarette, not illegal contraband, Charlie was not released for 3 more days. When he returned, he ordered another killing, this of ranch hand Donald Shea, who he believed had snitched to police, and possibly had. After Charlie's arrest on August 19th, Stephanie went to Anaheim to stay with her parents. Days after Charlie was released, Shea was killed. On September 1st, the family left Spawn Ranch and went to Death Valley. On September 4th, Stephanie called Spawn Ranch, hoping to escape her parents' house. Steve Clem Grogan and Lynette Squeaky Frome drove down to pick her up, returned to Spawn Ranch, and then a few hours later left for Death Valley. Stephanie's arrival upset Manson. That week, Charlie hit the pregnant 17-year-old in the head with a rifle. He also beat several other women. He was absolutely brutal, controlling, and hysterical those final weeks in the desert. One of those young women, Kitty Lutesinger, who we will be discussing further in this video, was also pregnant by Bobby Beausoleil. She was a frequent source of Manson's ire. He claimed she reminded him of his mother. In the desert, Kitty bonded with Stephanie Schramm. One day, the two teens decided to escape. In the evening on October 9th, while Charlie was on a trip back to L.A., Stephanie and Kitty snuck out of the ranch after sunset into the desert. With no food and in pitch darkness, they got lost, but kept going. At 4 a.m. on Friday, October 10th, hours after Stephanie and Kitty made their escape, law enforcement converged around Barker Ranch. They included the California Highway Patrol, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, and the National Park Service. They were looking for the culprits of a recent arson in the state park, the torching of a large earth mover. The family were sequestered at two properties in Death Valley, Barker and Myers Ranches. A few people were out of the region, but everyone else was arrested, and again the children taken into protective custody. Several officers remained at Barker Ranch to continue searching for evidence of stolen goods and arson. Suddenly, Kitty and Stephanie, out all night lost in circles, stepped from behind the sagebrush and begged the officers to assist them. They told them that the family was dangerous, maybe murderous, and they were desperate to get away from them. Both were taken into protective custody, and although brought to the same jail, were kept away from the others. Kitty and Stephanie called their families from jail, but Kitty was booked in connection with the Hinman murder, since investigators back in L.A. knew someone else had been at Hinman's home with Bobby, weren't sure who, and wanted to talk with his girlfriend to find out what she knew. The only person not charged during the Death Valley raid was Stephanie Schramm. Over the next 2 months, police slowly began to gather enough information to implicate the family in the summer 1969 murder spree, and family members were held over or rearrested on both homicide and arson charges. Vincent Bugliosi was appointed prosecutor in November 69, and he began the months-long investigation leading to the trials of Manson and several others. Bugliosi did speak with Stephanie Schramm to learn about her experience with Manson and the family. She told investigators about life at Barker and Spawn ranches, including what she called the murder school that Manson had been running. Stephanie, who gave birth to her first child in early 70, did testify later that year against Manson at trial. She became a certified canine groomer, married, and raised a family. In 2011, she was interviewed by Tate-LaBianca radio show and gave an account of her time with Charlie and the family. She admitted to the host that she would like to write a story about her experience. She was also interviewed for the 2020 docuseries Helter Skelter, an American Myth at Epix TV. Today, Stephanie lives in the San Diego area, and her children are grown. In the spring of '69, members of the Manson family were living in a 2-story house in Canoga Park in San Fernando Valley. On April 1st that year, a 17-year-old was hitchhiking and got picked up in a VW van driven by 2 young women. One woman was Stephanie Rowe, the other was Deidre Shaw, the daughter of a well-known film actress. Both of these young women were associates of Charles Manson, and the hitchhiker, Barbara Hoyt, drove with them to the Canoga Park house, nicknamed the Yellow Submarine, on Gresham Street. Barbara had run away from home. She explained, "I got in a fight with my dad. I don't even remember what it was about, and stomped off. I was picked up by 2 of the girls. One was Deidre Shaw, Angela Lansbury's daughter. I met Charlie that first night. They had dinner, and everybody sat on the floor. We passed around casseroles and salads. After the meal, the group shared a couple of joints. Then Charlie got out his guitar." The following day, Manson took Barbara for a motorcycle ride, and we went for donuts. He was very nice. Then she learned about Helter Skelter. Sadie was the one who told me about it. She told me Helter Skelter was coming. She said the blacks were going to rise against the whites, but the family would escape it. They were building dune buggies with fur seats and gun mounts. They were making clothes out of hides. I thought, wow, it's like camping. Hoyt didn't really believe the story about a race war, but escaping into the desert on dune buggies sounded like a hoot. During the summer of '69, Barbara was among those who watched the children, held in a secluded spot at Spahn Ranch. I babysat the family children. Linda Kasabian visited her little girl several times a day. She brought her food and treats and toys. She fed her, played with her, loved her. Danny DiCarlo also visited his son a couple times a day, and Mary Bruner also visited her son about once a day. But not once did Sadie, Susan Atkins, visit her baby son, not even once. Charlie's preoccupation that July was military-style training, the murder school that Stephanie Schramm later told investigators about. This training included field exercises, like proper way to kill somebody, stab them, then yank the knife upward apparently, and martial arts. The man conducting informal kung fu lessons was known as Karate Dave. Lynette Frome recounted, Charlie was driving the three-wheeler around the valley one night with three of us girls in the back when, at a stoplight, we met Karate Dave on a rust-dusted Indian motorcycle, a nice old bike. Dave wasn't bad looking either. He was atypically clean-cut, blonde, and masculine, and he came home with us after a few more stoplights. Charlie called him Karate Dave after learning he had a black belt. Barbara Hoyt had a crush on Dave, who was AWOL from the military. At Spahn Ranch, Karate Dave got bit by a rattlesnake and was glassy-eyed for hours, but recovered. Barbara and Dave were a bit of an item that summer. It was on an outing together that Hoyt got arrested for shoplifting, and this mugshot was the result. The couple gave the names Dave and Barbara Lipset at arrest. On the night of Friday, August 8th at Spahn Ranch, Barbara was asked by Susan Atkins to find dark clothes, creepy crawly clothes, for several people. Susan did not explain why she needed the clothes. I got a call on the ranch's field phone from Sadie, who was up at the front of the ranch. She wanted me to bring 3 sets of dark clothes. I got the clothes from a big pile we kept and brought them to the front, but they'd already left. Sadie found the clothes elsewhere, and then she, Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian drove off on their mission of murder. The next afternoon, Barbara was watching television when Sadie interrupted her. I was in a trailer watching Hobo Kelly, a kids' show. Sadie came in and demanded I turn the channel to the news. She told me to call Tex and Patricia. One of them said, "The Soul sure picked a good one." They called Charlie that sometimes, the Soul. Then they started laughing. That night, 2 more murders were committed by the killers. Over the next couple days, tensions were high at Spahn Ranch, although the family had no idea just how surveilled they were at the time. But things were getting desperate and strange. Toward the end, they were cutting their hair in strange patterns, reminisced Barbara Hoyt. They cut it really short, leaving one strand or little loop of hair long, so it looked ridiculous. By cutting their hair, it was another act of giving up your ego. It was a little ego death, the death of the individual. I remember Sadie remarking to someone that I had done a lot of things for the family, but I had not had sex with a girl, and I had not gone on a creepy crawl, and I should get my hair cut. That I needed my hair cut. Somebody said, "She doesn't want her hair cut." And Sadie said, "All the more reason to do it." I remember thinking I didn't want to get my hair cut, and I didn't want to go on a creepy crawl. I was becoming more and more discontented. During the August 6th raid, Barbara was among those arrested. At booking, she gave the name Barbara Wire. A week later, according to her own later reports, Barbara heard someone screaming down near one of the creeks on the ranch. She swore that the screams were from Shorty Shea. She said, "I was in a trailer on high ground, and below that was a creek bed. Charlie, Tex, Bruce Davis, and Steve Grogan chased Shorty down there. It was around 10 at night. I heard a scream and got up. The moon was bright and I could see the imprint of leaves on the window screen. I thought, maybe I imagined that. I lay back down and the screams started again, and they kept happening and happening and happening. It was Shorty. I recognized his voice. I was scared. I crouched in a ball on the floor. The statement she made about it being night initially left me in doubt about Barbara's memory. All accounts of Shorty's death place it in the morning, perhaps late morning. It was not until I visited Spawn Ranch and walked to the site of Shorty's slaying that I learned that Shorty was dragged into a culvert where he lay for hours. He was not dead, but barely alive. At some point that day, he roused enough to scream for help, but help never came. Once the family got to Death Valley, the murder of Shorty was common knowledge. Barbara Hoyt told Los Angeles Magazine in 2009, "I heard Charlie talking about it. He said, 'Shorty died with a little help from us. He was hard to kill, but we brought him to now.'" Barbara also testified that Bruce Davis said that Shorty was just a fucking pig and a drunk that nobody would miss. They said they had something that they wanted to show him. And then he got into the dune buggy and they took him away. And then they hit him in the head with a pipe. They pulled him out of the car and they started stabbing him. And then they kept stabbing him and stabbing him. And Charlie said, or Shorty said, "Why, Charlie, why?" And Charlie said, "Why? This is why." And then he stabbed him again. And he said that it was very hard to kill him until they brought him to now. We do not, in fact, know that Charles Manson personally stabbed Shorty Shea. As the news of Shorty's murder began to spread, so too slowly did hints of the Tate and LaBianca killings make their way around the family. Barbara recalled, "In early September, I was taking a nap in the bedroom at Myers Ranch. I woke up and heard Sadie talking to Ruth Ann Morehouse. I didn't pay attention until I heard the name Tate. Then I started listening." She said that Sharon Tate was the last to die, that she had to watch the others die first. She said that Sharon had called for her mother. She said that Abigail had called for God. And she said Tex ran over and gutted her. I walked back to Barker Ranch and saw Tex. He said, "Barbara, your face is all the colors of the desert." I thought that if he or anyone else figured out what I knew, I wasn't going to be alive anymore. I started working on trying to get out of the desert. Around September 15th, Charlie tried to force Simi Valley Sherry, a 16-year-old new member of the family, to perform oral sex on one of the men. Sherry refused, and Charlie beat her soundly. He then forced Barbara to do what Sherry refused, and in fear for her safety, Hoyt complied. That night, Sherry and Barbara started talking. Barbara whispered that she overheard Sadie talking about stabbing someone. In panic, the teens decided to run away. They didn't sneak out covertly into the night. At dawn on the 16th, they simply announced their intention to leave and walked away. When Charlie discovered Sherry and Barbara missing, he tore into whoever was on sentry and then drove into Ballarat. He found the girls eating breakfast in the local general store. He stood outside, using some kind of witchy hand signals. The girls went out and flatly told him they weren't coming back. Charlie simmered down, gave them some cash, and wished them well. The girls got a lift to Trona by the owner of the store, where they bought some shoes and purchased bus tickets back to L.A. Barbara found her way back to her folks. Initially, nobody was certain where Sherry had gone, and some actually believed that she was one of the many other rumored victims of the Manson gang, but she simply went underground. Charlie's clemency, of course, was a facade. Once back at Barker Ranch, he ordered Clem and Bruce to drive to Los Angeles, find Barbara and Sherry, and kill them both. Luckily, the two were unable to locate either girl. Charlie got upset and drove to Los Angeles to try to find Sherry and Barbara himself. He was also unsuccessful. Barker Raid Ranch occurred a couple weeks later, and within that month, the family were implicated in the summer murder spree. In early December, during the lead up to the grand jury, several members of the family were talking to investigators, some attempting to secure plea deals. Barbara called police on December 2nd of her own volition. Over the next several months, she met with prosecutors and discussed her potential testimony at trial. She was upfront that she was scared for herself and for her family. But she also felt a moral responsibility to tell the truth. Several of the women had visited her and hinted that she should not take the stand. In July 1970, the trial against Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten began with 18 days of testimony by star witness Linda Kasabian. Tex Watson was still down in Texas fighting extradition. Barbara Hoyt again met with the prosecutor to discuss testifying in the upcoming weeks. On September 5th, 1970, Barbara Hoyt flew to Hawaii with Ruth Ann Morehouse. The family had continued to hound Barbara, insinuating that her folks could be in jeopardy if she testified against Charlie, and that she'd be happier if she were back with them. I was getting death threats, Hoyt recalled. Sometimes I knew who was calling. It was Squeaky or Sandy. The prosecution had to give my depositions to the defense, so they knew what I was going to say, and they knew it wasn't going to be good for Charlie. I stayed in touch with a few of them, trying to make them think I was still on their side. Using assumed names, the two girls flew to Honolulu, where they booked the penthouse suite of the Hilton Hawaiian Village Hotel. Barbara saw little of the islands, however, since Oish, sure the police would be looking for Barbara, insisted they remain in the suite. At approximately the same time each morning, Oish made a long-distance call. Just after the call on the 9th, Oish's manner suddenly changed. She became very serious and looked at me kind of strangely, Barbara said. Oish told Barbara that she had to go back to California, but that Barbara was to remain in Hawaii. She called and made a reservation on the 1:15 flight to Los Angeles that afternoon. They caught a cab to the airport, arriving just before noon. Oish said she wasn't hungry, but suggested that Barbara eat something. They went into a restaurant, and Barbara ordered a hamburger. When it arrived, Oish took it and went outside, telling Barbara to pay the check. There was a line at the cash register, and for several minutes, Barbara lost sight of Oish. When she came out, Oish gave her the hamburger, and Barbara ate it while they were waiting for Oish's flight. Just before she was to board, Oish remarked, "Imagine what it would be like if that hamburger had 10 tabs of acid in it." Barbara's response was, wow. She had never heard of anyone taking more than 1 tab of LSD. After Ruth Ann departed, Barbara then went into the city. All of a sudden, I was feeling really weird, very high, and I realized there were 10 tabs of acid in the hamburger. I got to a bathroom and I made myself throw up. I don't know how I did it, but I got to the steps of the Salvation Army building. A man asked me, "Are you all right?" I said no. I told him to call Mr. Bugliosi. They took me to a hospital and gave me Valium by IV to bring me down. That's when I lost consciousness. Even though they tried to kill me, I had to testify. I'd seen Sharon Tate's mother on TV talking about her grief. That's what swayed me. What it finally came down to for me was this. Did I want to be able to live with myself when I got old? I decided that I did. Barbara was flown home a few days later and became one of the most willing witnesses against the killers. The attempt to silence her actually turned her into a staunch opponent against the family for the rest of her life. Ruth Ann was later indicted for the attempted witness tampering, as was Squeaky, Gypsy, Clem, and another member of the family, but Ruth Ann skipped the state and went into hiding. Years later, she turned herself in, was given leniency by the court, and we believe she made a private apology to Barbara. A couple years after the trials, Barbara Hoyt had applied to nursing school and was turned down, in part because of the notoriety attached to her name. She reached out to Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, who petitioned the school, and they relented. Barbara did become a registered nurse. She married, had one daughter, and later divorced. In later years, Hoyt also spoke publicly on news programs and documentaries about her time with Manson and the family, and the experience of testifying against them. She also became friends with Deborah Tate, the younger sister of family victim Sharon Tate. Barbara made frequent appearances at parole hearings for the convicted killers, urging not to release any of them. Barbara died December 3, 2017, of kidney failure. She was 63 years old. Her daughter has also become a nurse. In early 1968, when Manson and several women were living in the Topanga Beach area, they met a talented young musician named Bobby Beausoleil. Beausoleil had been on the periphery of the music and acting scene in Hollywood and in San Francisco. He was an attractive young man who seemed to have no lack of sexual or romantic pursuers, and in the summer of 1968, he was in a polyamorous relationship with 3 other women, including Catherine Gypsy Shea and Leslie Van Houten. When Charlie and the family left for Death Valley in autumn 1968, Bobby largely was doing his own thing. In early '69, he was again attempting to infiltrate the entertainment industry, and that March, he signed a songwriting contract with the Girard Agency near the Whiskey A Go-Go. That season, Beausoleil was living with Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson and his friend, talent scout Greg Jacobson, on North Beverly Glen, and he was dating then 16-year-old Catherine Lutesinger. Kitty, as she was known, grew up on a horse ranch north of L.A. Kitty was a strawberry blonde with lots of freckles and a tanned Malibu Barbie spunkiness. She was introduced to Bobby through Jacobson. That May, Kitty got pregnant with Bobby's child. She was not the first person, however, that Bobby knocked up that year. Earlier, he had also impregnated Manson family member Sandra Good, and weeks before that, his former girlfriend Gail Massman. So that would be 3 babies born to Bobby between July 1969 and February 1970. No wonder they called him Cupid. During the spring of '69, Kitty and Bobby intermittently lived with Dennis Wilson, with her parents in Devonshire, and with Gary Hinman, the musician friend of Beausoleil's who lived in a rented home in Topanga Canyon. Bobby was working with Jacobson and producer Terry Melcher on a film soundtrack that spring. He didn't want his girlfriend alone while he was working. Kitty was newly pregnant when Bobby brought her to Spawn Ranch the first time to meet Manson and the family. Charlie had issues with her right away. He claimed that she looked like his mother. Manson believed that Bobby was being pulled away from the family by Kitty. He wanted Beausoleil with Leslie Van Houten, and held Bobby's wandering against Leslie as though she failed to keep him. Despite his misgivings, Charlie let Bobby and Kitty move to Spawn Ranch on June 1st. About 6 weeks later, for reasons we are still parsing out all these decades past, Bobby murdered Gary Hinman. Reasons we have been told, by Beausoleil, by Charlie, and by others, included a potential drug deal gone bad, or just the need to get money out of someone who had been generous with the family before. For a day and a half, Gary was held captive, tortured, cut with a sword, and eventually stabbed and smothered by Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Bruner, Susan Atkins, with a little help from Charles Manson. The killers also stole 2 cars from the victim before leaving the scene and returning to Spawn Ranch. Why Bobby killed Gary, we may never fully understand why. He was at the absolute apex of his creative potential at that moment. Why he felt he had to either defend the family or please Charlie or ingratiate himself with a group of outlaw bikers, or whatever reason it happened, seems baffling considering he was about to be a 3 times father with a burgeoning career as a musician. Just the day before Beausoleil, Bruner, and Atkins went to Gary's Topanga Canyon home, Kitty begged Bobby to leave the ranch with her. She felt uncomfortable there. Bobby asked Charlie if that was okay, and Manson said no. Days after Gary's murder on July 30th, Charlie threatened to cut Kitty and she ran away. We do not believe she was aware of Hinman's murder, although Bobby had been back to the ranch since. A neighbor of Spawn Ranch, a man named Frank Retz, who was in the process of buying some of the acreage from owner George Spawn, was there with another neighbor when Kitty attempted to escape. According to Ed Saunders, Miss Lutesinger ran through the brush and asked for protection from Manson. Retz drove Miss Lutesinger to a police station, and she was transported by police officers to her parents' horse ranch. After returning home, Miss Lutesinger was very afraid and kept all doors to her parents' house locked for several days because Charlie, she said, had told her he would kill her mother and sister if she left the ranch. She refused to answer the phone even when Bobby called to say he was going to San Francisco. Bobby's ex-girlfriend Gail had just delivered a baby girl. Bobby was leaving in a few days to drive north to see his new daughter, but he never made it to San Francisco. The following day, Gary's body was found by friends. 5 days later, Bobby was arrested in Gary's car on Highway 101, heading north. The weapon, a bloody knife, was found in the car along with bloody clothing in the rear of the car. Meanwhile, Kitty had no idea where Bobby was. For the next few days, she frantically called the ranch over and over, looking for her boyfriend. During those days, Kitty was visited by Deputy Sheriff William Gleason of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office. Gleason was investigating reports of auto theft at the ranch. He'd compiled a dossier of information about Manson and the family, and first met Kitty when Frank Retz dropped her off at the police station. Gleason went to the Lutesinger's ranch on August 10th to interview her. Unbeknownst to Gleason at that time, the family was responsible for a lot worse than auto theft. Kitty told him about the cars, drugs and guns, stolen credit cards, plus the underage runaways living at Spawn Ranch. Gleason looked up Manson's record and discovered a statutory rape arrest on June 4th. It was not pursued. He realized that he was dealing with more than just a thieving group of hippies, but he needed a few more days to arrange to bring them into custody. Kitty was unaware that Bobby had been arrested for Gary's murder, but she had seen the news reports about Cielo Drive and Los Feliz, the 2 nights of murder committed by Charles Tex Watson and others in the family, and she asked Gleason whether the Black Panthers killed Sharon Tate. He replied that it didn't appear that any blacks were involved. I had been programmed to believe it was the Panthers who did it, Kitty recalled. The Panthers had also been implicated in the Hinman murder by evidence left at the scene to throw off investigators who, nonetheless, were clueless about the meaning of the bloody paw print Bobby left in Gary's home, in the victim's blood. Kitty didn't know that the family were the real culprits of the Tate and LaBianca murders, but if she had mentioned Helter Skelter to the sheriff, perhaps the killers might have popped up on the radar sooner. Certainly, if she had mentioned the words Helter Skelter written in blood in the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, wouldn't this have connected them to Waverly Drive? But after her interview that August 10th, Kitty went incommunicado for 2 months. She was about to return to Spawn Ranch. On August 15th, Kitty got into an argument with her mother and called the ranch, asking for someone to pick her up. Gypsy and Sadie rode out to Devonshire to bring the 17-year-old back. Right there on her parents' driveway, Sadie chopped off Kitty's hair, leaving one witchy strand. Most of the women had sheared their hair in the past week, some kind of ceremonial cutting. Sadie and Gypsy told Kitty to burn one hair, bury one hair, and turn the rest over to the soul. Charlie was the soul. Kitty, who was only returning because she thought she'd be reunited with Bobby, glumly rode back to Chatsworth, shorn of her strawberry blonde locks. Hours later, the ranch was raided by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office with about 100 other officers from other jurisdictions. At arrest, Kitty gave the name Catherine Lynn Drake. Now, the LASO knew that she was Beausoleil's girlfriend, that he was in county jail on a murder rap, and that Kitty was telling the police all kinds of horror stories about the family. But Sheriff Gleason apparently didn't know she was among the arrested. While Kitty was in custody, Gleason called her mother. Mary Lutesinger did not know where her daughter was and had reported her as a runaway. So an APB was issued for the pregnant teen in connection to the murder of Gary Hinman. Meanwhile, Kitty was released with the others on the 18th when it was discovered that the warrant date apparently was inaccurate. A week later, members of the family killed another man near Spawn Ranch, believing he had been snitching to police and contributed to the August 16th raid. Days later, the family split the scene and headed back to Death Valley. In the desert, sequestered between two properties, Barker and Myers ranches, things got increasingly worse. Charlie was paranoid, angry, and abusive. He struck Stephanie Schramm in the head with a rifle. He routinely beat Diane, Snake, Lake, and he also attacked Kitty Lutesinger on several occasions. Once, during a late-night powwow around the fire, Kitty had the audacity to fall asleep during one of Charlie's tirades. He punched her in the face repeatedly for her insubordination. Those final weeks in the desert were hell. Stories about the murders were being whispered around, and the younger girls in particular were trapped and terrified. They were awake by night, sleeping by day, heavily armed and guarded. Charlie would drive back and forth between L.A. and Death Valley, gathering provisions or looking for those who had run away from the family in fear. He spent countless hours preaching about Armageddon, warning everyone that the shit was coming down. It was during those miserable autumn days in Death Valley that Kitty learned what happened to Bobby Beausoleil. Sadie, Susan Atkins, started bragging, first about the murder of Gary Hinman, and later dropping hints about the deaths of Sharon Tate and the other victims at Cielo Drive. Kitty overheard Sadie tell someone that she stabbed someone in the legs before he was killed by someone else. Kitty was scared and demoralized. She had been able to bear Manson's brutality as long as she had Bobby to protect her, but now he was gone. She bonded with Stephanie Schramm, also feeling Charlie's wrath and also pregnant. The two teens decided to escape. In the evening, on October 9th, while Charlie was in Los Angeles, Stephanie and Kitty snuck out after sunset, heading into the desert. They had no food, and it was in pitch darkness. They got lost, but kept going. The next morning, law enforcement converged around Barker and Myers ranches to arrest the family on suspicion of arson. They rounded up the young men, women, and teens at both properties, plus the children, and took off, but left several officers at Barker Ranch to continue searching for evidence. In the early morning hours, suddenly Kitty and Stephanie crept from behind the sagebrush and begged the officers to help them. They told them that the family was dangerous, murderous, and they were desperate to get away. Both were taken into protective custody, and although brought to the same jail, were kept away from the others. Kitty and Stephanie called their families from jail, but Kitty was booked regarding the Hinman case. Deputy Sheriff Gleason from Los Angeles Sheriff's Office had been searching for Lutesinger, and Kitty's mother was frantic to find her daughter. On October 13th, Inyo County Police informed the Devonshire Division of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office that they had their APB subject, Catherine Kitty Lutesinger, in custody. Devonshire PD then called homicide detectives Charles C. Gunther and Paul J. Whiteley. Gunther and Whiteley were in charge of the Hinman investigation. They had interviewed Kitty's mother while her daughter was missing. Knowing that in her situation, Kitty was likely to be protective of her boyfriend and want to provide information on his behalf, Gunther and Whiteley hoped to speak to the teen. They first wanted to rule out her involvement, and then they hoped to offer her something for more info. They'd asked Devonshire PD to keep them informed if they learned of her whereabouts. After Devonshire contacted them, Gunther and Whiteley drove that morning to Independence to pick Lutesinger up. They brought her to the San Dimas Sheriff's Station, where she was then transferred to LA County's Juvenile Hall. Gunther and Whiteley's first interview with Kitty was at Juvie in the afternoon on October 13th. Kitty spoke to the detectives that day for 4 hours and implicated several family members in numerous serious crimes. Kitty told detectives that she overheard a call between Bobby and Sadie, in which Sadie told Bobby, "We screwed up." She also told them Sadie admitted stabbing a man several times in the leg, and the man fought back and yanked her hair. She told Whiteley and Gunther how bad things were at Barker Ranch, Manson had become a wild man, beating Snake and herself. Charlie threatened to hang people from trees, cut out their tongues. She told them, "When I start thinking about it, I remember how bad it really was, how he just talked about it so much, about snuffing people and torturing them and all kinds of orgies. You get so you just can't listen to it anymore. It really was pretty bad." Kitty was held for several days at juvenile hall, then released to her parents. The Inyo police later told Lutesinger they found a death list on Manson during the Barker arrests with her name on it. Whiteley and Gunther then recalled Kitty's comment about Sadie stabbing a man in the legs. They remembered that Hinman had not been stabbed in the legs, but Wojtek Frykowski, one of Sharon Tate's house guests murdered on August 9th, had. After 2 months with no substantive idea who had committed the Tate and LaBianca murders, the Hinman detectives picked up the phone and called the Tate team, demanding a meeting. On Halloween, Tate investigators interrogated Kitty. She repeated Sadie's statements about a man pulling her hair while she stabbed him in the legs, and still they didn't act upon it, nor had they called the Hinman team back. On November 12th, Susan and Bobby were each in court for the Hinman case. That's when Sadie learned that Kitty was the snitch, not Bobby. Back at jail, Sadie told another inmate that Kitty's life wasn't worth anything. In December, Susan Atkins was the lead witness at a grand jury that indicted Manson, Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Charles Watson, and others for murder. Those indictments would not have happened at that time had Kitty not been so forthcoming in her conversations with law enforcement. Meanwhile, the month before, Bobby got a hung jury for killing Gary Hinman, and a new trial set for early 1970. On February 11th, Kitty gave birth to Bobby's child, a daughter named Jenny. She also returned to the family. She was in the courtroom when, at Bobby's sentencing after his second trial, he was given the death sentence. She burst into sobs, falling into the arms of Beausoleil's parents. During the summer and fall of 1970, the trial of Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, Kitty joined the family and her sisters in protest. The prodigal daughter returned. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi had hoped to use her as a witness, but she had run away from home and returned to Spawn Ranch several times. Even the family kept her at arm's length, viewing her as weak and untrustworthy, although happy to include her in their sidewalk shenanigans. He was seen crawling on her hands and knees with the others, the X they all carved in mimicry of Charlie prominently displayed on her forehead. She was doing what she could to prove herself, leaving baby Jenny in the care of her mother. In 1972, after the convictions and the overturning of the death sentence, Kitty was still associating with the family. That year, Whiteley and Gunther, the detectives from the Hinman case, tried to assist new family member Dennis Rice's ex-wife. She'd reported her 4 children missing. We discussed this in the episode entitled Groupies. Rice left his kids with the family during his incarceration for armed robbery, committed with the family an effort to bust Charlie out of prison, but nobody knew where they were. Nobody in the family would talk to police or to Rice's ex-wife. Kitty agreed to speak with Whiteley and Gunther and helped lead police to a ranch in Lancaster, California. There, police found Rice's kids in a cave beneath a chicken coop. They had been trained to run and hide if the police showed up. Months later, on January 19, 1973, Kitty married Billy Gusher's brother, Veldon, another Aryan Brotherhood member. She and Veldon were divorced in 1978, and Kitty remarried. In 1978, she was arrested in Santa Cruz for fraud. Her daughter Jenny was then 8 years old. For many years, Kitty worked as an assistant principal at a Los Angeles area school. Today, she is retired and a musician for a bluegrass band living in the Rocky Mountain region. Her daughter Jenny is an animal rights advocate living in Southern California and raising a family.
I drift like a cloud.
The stories of these three young women are a sobering reflection of the complexities of love, loyalty, and identity in a time of social upheaval. While the 1960s presented itself as a moment of liberation, it often left young women stranded between two worlds, the traditional expectations they had inherited and the uncharted territory of countercultural freedom. For the girls who joined the Manson family, this tension became a trap, one that exploited their desires for connection, purpose, and emotional security. After the arrests of 1969, the fractures in the family became undeniable. One girl easily slipped away and had no qualms about testifying against the man who had poised himself as her lover and savior. Another girl wavered between loyalty and the truth, ultimately risking her life and sanity in favor of the truth. And the third girl, the one who had no real loyalty to Manson himself, the man who routinely beat and punched her, somehow could not extricate herself from the rest of the family. Their separate paths reveal the devastating power of patriarchal control, even in spaces that claim to reject it. For all the talk of free love, these young women were often treated as tools in service to the men who surrounded them, bonded emotionally and physically to people who placed their own desires above all else. And yet, their stories are not just about victimhood. They are about resilience, the struggle for self-identity, and the painful process of breaking free from a system that promised love but delivered only harm. In revisiting their lives, we are reminded of the countless young women, then and now, who seek belonging in a world that often gives them too few options for finding it safely. Their stories, as different as they are, converge in one critical way. They illuminate the enduring challenge of navigating love and freedom in a society that too often denies women the tools to claim both on their own terms. Stay tuned and join us for the next episode of What Became of the Manson Family. In this episode, we will learn what became of the youngest people who joined Manson and the others, the ones who were often used most callously as bait for other vulnerable young souls.